And the last one that we need to really think about, I mean, people do kind of realise this, but you tend not to think about it, and that's that money is in some sense neutral. Money is not neutral. Money is politically controlled, and when you spend that money, you are basically encouraging a system that is not in your interests and is not in the planet's interests. And this is why I particularly, we might as well have them all, I don't tend to make them come up one after another, because I just burble around what's there. Which is why, you know, I particularly like spending my Stroud pounds. When I sell them to people, I always say, enjoy your money. Being like a banker or a teller or something. But I really do enjoy spending them, because I know when I'm spending that money, I'm doing something good. When I'm spending sterling, I'm actually collaborating in a bad system, a destructive system. So, yeah, it's important to realise that economic activity is based on debt-based money. It's based on borrowed money. And so the money that relates to, it's obvious that if you have a system based on debt, the people who are borrowing the money will be the poorer people compared to the people who are lending the money. But then the people who are lending the money are paid interest by the borrowers. And so consequently, this system of money creation will enable money to be transferred from poor people to rich people. And that's the case in individual debt, it's the case in national debt. And it's the reason why people are, are asking all sorts of questions about debt. Why is every government in the world except 3 in debt? Who do they owe the money to? The point of the system is that the debt itself enables wealthy people to profit from poorer people, in my view. So it's a deeply political system. And it's a system that operates in favour of a very small number of wealthy people and not in the interest of the rest of us. So I suppose what I've got to do today is to sort of think about how we might have a money system that will be socially beneficial and ecologically beneficial, which is kind of counterposition to Mark, because he's going to argue it would be better to not have any money. At least I assume he is, perhaps we'll learn otherwise. But I think we do need money, but I think we need money that's socially and ecologically beneficial. So the first point about the money system we've got and the environment is also related to the way money is created as debt. This is a really nice Pollock cartoon which was actually created to draw attention to the iniquity of the debt crisis in poorer countries and how poor countries had to destroy their environments in order to pay their debts. But actually it applies to all money systems that create money as debt. Because as I said, you create that money in one time period, but you can make a claim for goods in the future. And because the money's been borrowed into existence, you then have to create value to pay that money back. And as you create that value through working and making things, you're using up resources. And so creating money in this way is actually putting a pressure on the planet and on its resources. It's also important to note that, the proportion of money created as debt by banks is huge now. I think we're going to see in a minute how that's changed over time. But 97% of money is created in that way. Governments do have the power to create money, but they've kind of decided not to use that for reasons, I would say, of political pressure, or to not use it very much. And also 95% of transactions that take place in this money system don't actually contact goods at all. They're not about people, selling us coffee and us selling them university places or whatever daft thing is supposed to go on in the global economy. They're basically about some kind of gambling system. I think most people are onto that now. It's an enormous casino system. There are all sorts of bizarre, what they call financial products, which, relate to the likelihood of somebody else repaying their debt, or a whole load of completely crazy things, derivatives. And it's basically a system where money swaps around related to the probabilities of events occurring. It's nothing to do with trade or production for most of the money that's out there and most of the money that changes hands. Okay, I think I've made that point. Okay, so here's a graph that just shows you the relationship between money creation and growth in the economy. If you ask a conventional economist about this, they will say, yes, there is a relationship between the amount of money and the amount of economic activity, but it's a lagged variable. That's one of their really good things, a lagged variable, like, only in the short run. That's another one of their really good things. Anyway, the lagged variable means, initially, you're right, there will be a gap between the money creation and the economic activity, but over time, the gap will close. Well, this graph shows that that's absolute nonsense, and in fact, over time, the gap has hugely increased. Here's the blue line showing you the amount of money in circulation in the UK, and there's the red line showing you the amount of actual economic activity. And you can see that over time, you know, money has inflated massively and growth hasn't been able to keep up. And actually that's a good thing, because otherwise we would have massive rates of economic growth and far more ecological impact than we've already got. But the point in showing you this graph is to say that there's a kind of tendency for these two lines to want to come together. And so if you keep creating money in this way, in a sort of uncontrolled way, that will introduce into your economy this pressure to grow. In fact, I think it's the reason that capitalist economies have to grow. And it's the reason why, you know, that this is the kind of obsession of our politicians to say, well, we must have economic growth, you know. And you sometimes are thinking, yeah, but why must we have economic growth? Why can't we just stop and share out what's there already? And, you know, logically we might think that, but in terms of the way our money system works, we have to have economic growth because we have to try and get that red line to meet up with the blue line, I think. Here's the graph that shows you the relationship between public money and private money since I was born, not in Bath, but in Wrexham, but I did come here when I was 3. In 1963, anyway, around that time, you know, you can see the relationship between government-produced money and bank-produced money. Governments created, I think it was about a third of money at the end of the Second World War. And since that time, they've given away their right to produce money, and they've allowed banks to be responsible for the issue of credit into the economy. So, just to say that governments can print money. We're living in this age of austerity, or of austeria, as some people like to call it. And, but actually the government could print money and could spend it on hospitals. There's nothing to stop them doing that. It's an ideological decision not to do that. Okay, so this is an important point as well. I've already touched on this. Who has the power over our money? Who controls what happens in our money? Some people in the room are probably old enough to remember when you went abroad and you couldn't just take an endless amount of money. You couldn't get money out of a cash point in somebody else's country at all. You had to exchange the money here, and the government controlled how much you could take, and it was 25 quid in a year, I think, because they didn't want you taking our money into somebody else's country. There were exchange controls, and there were also credit controls, which means that the government didn't let you borrow money unless you had an agreement. You had to have a hire purchase agreement. And the mortgages were also controlled. So building societies couldn't just say, yes, I think you can pay, I'll give you a mortgage. The government decided how much debt it was healthy for our economy to have. So that's a system that some of us can remember, although it's not actually talked about or written about very much. That's a system where politicians controlled our money supply. And since 1971 and then 1986, when we had Big Bang, we've basically given that power up. We've given up the power to control money as a society, and we've allowed the private sector, financial institutions, to have that control. So we now have free movements of capital across borders. We've had the repeal in the US of legislation separating retail and investment banking, which was put in place to protect depositors' assets, actually. The regulators have retreated. There's been a hell of a lot of political pressure from the financial sector in order to reduce the amount of regulations, the amount of legislation it's had to be controlled by. Okay, and banks have been allowed to decide what was risky and what wasn't risky, and as we see, they didn't make very good decisions. So that's the kind of picture from the US side of the Atlantic, but it's very much the same picture on this side of the Atlantic. So, I mean, I relate that back to Big Bang in 1986, you know, the kind of, once Thatcher was really in power and she really felt she had a grip on things, then she just allowed the city to basically let rip and to control the finance in this country, which I think, you know, this is the number one thing we have to do. We have to get politicians back in control of finance. Oh yeah, there we are. Exchange controls were abolished. One of the first things that was done in 1979 was the end of exchange controls. So the government said, we're no longer controlling the pound sterling, the market's controlling it. And at that time you could take £500 out of the country at one time. So, you know, if you went on an expensive holiday, then that was probably your money done for the year. Okay?